So our next concept that we studied was measurement and sampling concepts, and we saw some definitions of population, samples, and observations. So what is population? In biology, population is all the individuals of a species that interact with one another to maintain a homogeneous gene pool. So that is the definition of population in biology. So what is the definition in statistics? It is any collection of individual items or units which are the subject of investigation. So that is known as a population in statistics. Then variable. Variable is that characteristic of a population which differs from individual to individual, for example, length, mass, age, temperature, proximity to a neighbor, or number of parasites. So that characteristic is known as variable, which is not constant, but which is variable, which differs from one individual to another individual in the population. Then what is sample? So if we have a large population, which usually we have large populations, large statistical populations to study, so it is rarely possible to obtain measures from all units in a population. So investigator has to collect information from a small subset, and that small subset represents the entire population, and this is known as sample. Unit. So unit is individual or item from which a record is obtained. That is known as a unit. And observation is a record of the variable which is obtained from each unit in the sample is known as the observation. And then we studied two important attributes of sampling which are very, very critical while you're designing and doing your experiment. The first one is to take care of random sampling, because the sample, as we saw, that it represents population from which it is drawn. So to be a truly representative of population, units in the sample, they must be drawn randomly from the population, and they should be sampled in a manner which is free of any kind of bias. And each unit in a population, it must have an equal chance of being drawn. So there shouldn't be any bias. So all of them, they should have equal chances of being drawn. So why it is important? Because if bias is present, then information will not be generalized on the population, and it reduces the confidence on estimations based on sampling. The other important attribute of sampling is independence. So many statistical tests assume that observation in a sample are independent of each other, which means that value of one observation in a sample is not inherently linked to that of another, so that again there is not overrepresentation of some specific type of values over the others. So these were the two important attributes of sampling. Then we studied different types of variables, there are different ways in which variables can be categorized. So here we are going to discuss two main types of variables, which are discontinuous or continuous variables. Discontinuous variables are those variables in which values assume integral whole numbers, which are usually count of things. And the continuous variables are those in which values in principle, they fall at any point along an uninterrupted scale, and these are usually measurements, for example, length and mass. So the data which is based on the observations of or the collection of discontinuous variables is known as the count data or the discontinuous data, and the data which is based on the values of continuous variable, it is known as the continuous data or measurement data. Then we saw the scales of measurement. Then generally there are 4 levels of the scales of the measurement, and each level has its own rules and perceptions, and each level is hierarchical, which means that it incorporates the properties of scale below it, and it adds its own additional properties. So these are the 4 levels: nominal scale, ordinal scale, interval scale, and ratio scale. So starting with the most elementary scale, which is the nominal scale, and nominal scale, as its name indicates, that it only identifies categories. And for the classification of individuals, the categories, they have to be mutually exclusive, which means that one individual cannot be placed in more than one category. So it only identifies individuals and places them into different groups or categories, for example, according to their species type, their color type, or their habitat type. So it does not involve ordering. So like if you place them in any order, that order doesn't have any kind of meanings. So the next one is ordinal scale. Ordinal scale involves classifying and labeling function of the nominal scale, which means that it puts individuals into different categories. But the one thing which is important here is, or one thing which is additional, is that it brings it to a sense of order. So in the previous scale, the order wasn't important, that you can order or you can arrange them into any order, but here the order is important. So ordinal numbers, they indicate rank orders, and nothing more. So these are not absolute quantities, they just rank individuals into different orders. Like consumer satisfaction for a product from highly satisfied to extremely dissatisfied, abundance of species from abundant to rare, and class ranks from top grader to the fail students. So these are the examples of ordinal scales. So ordinal scale, it is used to rank or arrange individuals, and it ranges them from highest to lowest or from lowest to highest according to the variable. And these numbers, they may not indicate absolute quantities. And also the interval between adjacent numbers or categories, it cannot be assumed to be equal. So in ordinal scale, the order of the categories is meaningful, but the difference between the orders, or between a difference between the different classes or categories, that is not supposed to be equal. So that can be variable. Then is the interval scale. Interval scale it involves the properties of the ordinal scale, that it involves it arranges different categories into an order, but it also recognizes how precisely far apart the units are on the scale. For example, difference between the values of 8th and 9th point on the scale, they are same as that between 2nd and 3rd. And these intervals can be added or subtracted because the difference between the intervals, or difference between different categories on an interval scale, that is same throughout the scale. So the interval scale, it has the properties of naming and the order, which is meaningful, and the interval has same interpretation throughout. And the thing which is lacking in the interval scale is that it doesn't have an absolute 0 point in it. Then is the ratio scale. It is the highest level of measurement, and it incorporates the properties of interval, ordinal, and nominal levels. And in addition to that, it has an absolute 0 point, due to which all mathematical procedures are possible. For example, measurement of length and mass. These are the examples of ratio scale. So these were the scales of measurement. Next thing that we studied was the processing and presenting of the data, that how we can process and present our data. So once we have generated the data, for example, this is the length of 100 shoots, which are rounded off to the nearest whole number. So this is a continuous variable because this is the length measurement of. So what information do you get from this table? Literally nothing, no information on a quick look at this table. So if we group these observations, if we arrange them in the form of a frequency table, then it will be more economical of space, and that will be more revealing. That is, it is going to give us more information about the trends in the data. So this is how we can make a frequency table, and we did all these exercises in the class, that how we can make these frequency distribution tables. And all of the tables, they must be followed with specific captions, that we have to describe that what kind of table is this and what it is describing. And then we saw that if we have a large spread of observations and the number of observations are relatively few, then how we can make the frequency class by aggregating different frequency classes, and we did an exercise on that as well. So this is the example of the masses of 50 samples that are arranged into a frequency table by aggregating the frequency classes. So here you can see that we have aggregated 3 frequency classes to make this frequency table. Then the data presentation, the graphical form of the data presentation, that how we can present the data in a graphical form, or to make it more representative. So there are different types of the graphs. So we started with the dot diagram, which is not used as a final form of presentation. It is just used during your analysis, that if you just want to have a quick look of your data, then you can make a dot diagram and just have a look at the trends in your data. Like length of 17 leaves, so you can draw this dot diagram to see that how the pattern looks like. Then the bar and the line plot, usually this is also not used as the final form of presentation, and in this case, instead of dots, we use the bars, or we use the lines to represent our data. So this is the number of different birds, and these numbers, they're represented in the form of lines. So this is known as the line plot or the bar plot. Then we come to the histogram, which is a very basic form of the graph, and which is usually used to present frequencies, and it is usually used for the continuous variables, but it can also be used for the count data. For example, we have the count of the number of orchids, and these are the frequencies in different quadrants, right? So this is the frequency distribution of orchid counts in different quadrants. So 7 quadrants that didn't have any orchid, then 1 quadrant it had 1, and so on. And then the continuous variables example. So in this case we have the length of fish. So this is arranged in the frequency table, and then we can present this in the form of a graph. So here is the graph for the length of fishes. Then frequency polygon and frequency curve. So if the midpoint of the top of each block in a histogram they are joined by a straight line, then it gives us a frequency curve or a frequency polygon. So here you can see that the distribution is not a smooth distribution, so this is a frequency polygon that we have. But if the distribution is smooth, then we have a smooth curve, which is a frequency curve. And another form of the graph that can be used to present the bivariate data specifically, that is known as the scattergram. So scattergram is used for bivariate data when pairs of observations of two variables they are obtained from each unit in a sample. So this is a two-dimensional presentation. Independent variable is usually plotted along x-axis and the dependent variable along y-axis. Example are mass and length of two animals. So these are the bivariate data in which two variables are recorded from each unit in the population. And in this case, these variables are length and mass. And this is how they are presented, and we had an exercise in the class that how we can make these scattergrams on the paper as well. And if we want to see the trend, we can add a trend line, and we can see that as the length is increasing, the mass is also increasing. Then another type of the basic graph is the pie or the circle graph, and this is suitable for the kind of data which are presented in the form of percentages or proportions. For example, the percentage of time spent on different activities, that is time budget analysis of two types of feral goats, nanny and billy goats. So this is how these graphs are made, and we had an exercise in the class that how these graphs they can be made on paper and how they can be made in Excel.